I'm Dr. Carl, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. G'day, Dr. Carl, University of Sydney, Shirtloads of Science, and today I'm interviewing Alice Driver. Hello, Dr. Alice.
Hello.
You've written this book, Life and Death of the American Worker, in big writing, and then it says, the immigrants taking on America's largest meatpacking company. Wow, it's got your name. And dear audience, you might think, what has this got to do with science or medicine? Well, poverty is a disease, and these people are poor, and they have diseases. Thank you for writing this wonderful book. Let me just start off with my first question. How? Tell me, why? How did you start this? Well, what made you get into this particular topic out of all the millions of things you could write about in the whole world?
I'm an investigative journalist, and I'm from the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas.
What, literally?
Yes.
This is not a cartoon. You literally come from the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, which is, I think, one of the poorest states in the USA.
It is.
And it has the worst education and medical statistics, etc.
It's usually ranked 48th or 49th in, for example, maternal mortality, or on a lot of the indicators it's ranked very low.
Did you grow up there, or were you born there, or both?
I was born in the Ozark Mountains and grew up there. So part of the reason that's connected to this story is I worked for many years as an investigative journalist. I was based in Mexico City. I never wanted to stay in Arkansas, but when the pandemic hit, I ended up back in Arkansas. Like many people, you know, the pandemic changed our lives, and many people ended up back at home or things like that. And because I know that the meatpacking industry, Arkansas is the home of the largest meatpacking company in the United States and the second largest globally.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And Walmart.
They're a wealthy family based in Arkansas?
The Walton family, which is the founders of Walmart, is the wealthiest family in the world.
Oh my God, that's a whole other book. Okay, wow.
It is.
Okay, so we're talking here about Tyson, which is the second biggest meatpacking company in the whole world. Mm-hmm. And you're suggesting, by the title of your book, Life and Death of the American Worker, Life and Death, you're suggesting that perhaps their working conditions, let me put it delicately, are suboptimal?
Yes. I started this project with funding for one article. I got $2,000 in funding to write an article, actually for an Arkansas newspaper. And I was interested in work conditions at meatpacking facilities because I'm from Arkansas, and the state employs a lot of workers in the industry, but I had never heard from a worker. And I found that strange. And I knew that with COVID and the way that workers are on a line and they're elbow to elbow, thousands of workers. So I knew that COVID was going to change the industry in some way.
You would expect that if they're really close, infectious diseases can spread. So I'm presuming that the right thing would have been that they would have cut down their production or had special protection for the workers? That's a question?
Yeah, the right thing to do would have been for meatpacking companies to follow the CDC recommendations about COVID.
CDC is the Center for Disease Control.
Yep. Which would include social distancing and, having masks and quarantining for workers who test positive, things like that. But what the reality of what happened was quite different once I started interviewing workers. And the first part of this is that it's very hard to interview workers. Most workers are immigrants and refugees. Many of these people are undocumented. Many of them are illiterate.
They are undocumented, yet they're allowed to work for the second largest meatpacking company in the whole world.
Yeah, it's hard to measure undocumented work, but studies say that anywhere between 20 and 50% of the meatpacking industry in the U.S. is undocumented labor.
Wow, that means that they could, if the meatpacking companies were unethical, could be exploited unfairly, possibly.
Yeah, and so part of the difficulty of interviews is that workers know that if they speak to a journalist and use their real name, they're afraid of retaliatory tactics, whether that they'll be fired, or many people have multiple family members working at the same company. And so when I started interviewing people, I offered everyone anonymity because that's the only way people would speak to me. In the book, actually, the only people who whose real names I use are people who died, with the exception of one other person who no longer works at Tyson.
Wow. So I'm guessing then that the health conditions inside the factory are suboptimal, that people can get injured?
Yes, so I'm from Arkansas, and I've often been told, Arkansas is a state that most people haven't heard of. As a journalist, when I try and pitch stories about Arkansas, it's kind of a state that's largely ignored. And what I find interesting is that we have Tyson, we have two of the largest global companies in the world, and also the history of Bill Clinton, who was president of the United States, and he was very close friends with the Tyson family. So I really wanted to revisit his relationship with the Tyson family and also his policies as he was the governor of Arkansas and then the president of the United States. Because meatpacking is a bipartisan problem in terms of labor conditions and also treatment of animals. It's an industry that's really, both parties have kind of given it a pass when it comes to regulations.
So both sides of politics in the USA have ignored it and just let it do what it wants?
Well, they've done what you do when, kind of the starve the beast theory of...
No, what's
Do you
that?
know this?
No,
In terms of the regulatory body that oversees the meatpacking industry in the U.S., it's called OSHA, which is Operational Health and Safety Administration. And so the number of people working there is very small. And someone did a study that said that if OSHA was to visit every meatpacking facility in the United States, it would take something like 100 years to visit the facilities. So you have a regulatory body that's underfunded and understaffed, and fines that are, for example, the fine for child labor, which is another issue that I talk about in my book, is $15,000.
That's peanuts to a huge company.
Tyson made $53 billion last year. So $15,000 fine for using child labor is, in a sense, nothing to them.
So with regard to, I'm sort of thinking medical here, and health issues, what about the noise in the factory? Surely they're tested from time to time to see if they're getting hearing damage?
Yes, and so all these workers that I followed, one of the workers who'd been at Tyson for a long time, and he was in his 50s, he told me, for example, his hearing had been lost for years. His hearing was not good, but he said, every year I go and I take the test, and they say, you passed, good job. And he said, I know and they know that it's because they need bodies on the line. There's a labor shortage in the industry. That's kind of one example of what happens, both with hearing issues, with medical issues as well, that they want to maintain production and maintain bodies on the line so that companies can keep profits up.
Okay, so they've got these chickens coming down the line. How many chickens would come down per minute down the line where a typical dumpster workers would be, like 5 or 10 a minute?
So they call it birds per minute, and the maximum in the U.S. currently is 175, I think, birds per minute.
And so how long would it take a worker to, for example, debone a chicken? Like, would it be a minute?
So I had workers who worked in the debone area show me, since I'm not allowed, it's against the law for me to enter a facility.
We'll get back to that in a second. Yeah, go on, yeah.
Show me how long does it take to debone a chicken. So the chicken comes down the line on a cone, and a worker debones a chicken in 3 to 5 seconds. They have a metal mesh glove that goes up to here because you want to prevent cutting yourself. So they debone it. You have to be very strong because you're cutting through bone, and if you're not strong enough, it gets stuck and it can drag you. Actually, workers have been dragged inside the machine, and then it can really mangle your hand or your arm if you get dragged in or caught up in the machinery down the line. And then they have to sharpen the knife, because if the knife isn't sharp, then it can also get stuck. And they work 8-hour shifts. Some of them work 10-hour shifts. So just imagine the level of strength, and also workers are never told what the birds per minute is on the line.
Oh, really?
No, so they don't actually know. They're just like, it was faster today, it's getting faster.
So they're working on the line, they're doing these actions. I imagine that they're doing as sort of like a cog in a machine, the same action over and over, not just for hours per day, but days per week and perhaps weeks per month and months per year. Do they have any long-term problems with that mentally, doing the same thing over and over?
Well, there's two things that I found. One you might expect, which is that most workers eventually get carpal tunnel syndrome, and they need most workers, yeah.
You mean by most? You mean more than half?
I can't remember the exact data point, but it is a significant number of workers. Almost all the workers I interviewed either had carpal tunnel surgery or needed carpal tunnel surgery. One thing that I discovered that I think is something I never would have thought of is I was interviewing workers about what they did at work, and at one point we had a moment where we were talking about dreams, like what I dreamed at night, what they dream at night. And a worker said to me, "I don't dream at night, I keep working." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Actually, I keep doing the repetitive motions of the debone line in my sleep. And I even scratch my husband. And I've even been to the doctor to get help because I can't stop working and I never rest."
Oh, wow. There are so many issues you've raised. In your fine book, can you tell the audience the title of it? Oh, there it is, Life and Death of the American Worker. You talk about, I never heard of this, ag-gag laws. What are they?
Ag-gag laws, so Arkansas is one of the many states, and it's mainly states that have a strong agricultural meatpacking industry presence, and they're framed as laws to protect the industry's secrets and things like that. But in reality, it means that it's against the law for me to set foot on Tyson Foods property, to enter the facility with the purpose of writing about it, photographing it, taking video, recording, and that's also true for workers.
What?
And the maximum fine in Arkansas is $5,000 per day if you violate the ag-gag laws.
Haven't you got some amendment that talks about freedom of speech in the USA?
It's a very good question. And so that's another reason why it's hard for workers to speak about conditions. And so the workers that I interviewed, many of them risked a lot. They shared photos and videos and audio from inside meatpacking facilities with me, which really was key to me being able to put together this story.
I believe somehow you know the secret to making chicken nuggets, and my dream is that there's beautiful pieces of chicken that are delicately taken off and then coated in batter and then put together with love and individually heated to the right temperature. Is it not quite like that, I'm guessing?
Well, one of the workers in my book who I interviewed, who was really incredible, he was sending me videos and photos. He worked in the chicken nugget area of the meatpacking plant. And so every day in the morning, they get these pallets of chicken. They come in 30-pound blocks. They're frozen. And he sent me videos. They look almost grayish, pinkish.
I imagine the colour might change from day to day depending on how it's been treated before it got there. What sort of colours?
Well, he said sometimes it's green, sometimes it's purple.
Oh my God, the bacteria, oh my God, okay, right, go on, yes.
I said, okay, well, what's the industrial recipe for chicken nuggets? And he said, it's 3 blocks of like blood and bones, and 1 block of skin and fat, and 1 block of chicken breast, and then spices, and then butter, and then flour. And he was always complaining about weevils in the flour.
What? Physical weevils in the flour?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of the workers would send me photos of bugs or, infestations, because the plant is such a moist. It's either very, very hot, like in the kill area where they're killing chickens, or it's very cold in the areas where they're trying to freeze products like nuggets. And so in those extremes, like in the parts of the plant where it's hot, they would talk about problems with like worms or anyway, different things that were around the plant.
So my dream of chicken nuggets is not quite the same. And to whom do these chicken nuggets go, bearing in mind that Tyson is the biggest company in the USA? What sort of, you're allowed to say what companies they supply the chicken nuggets to?
Yeah, part of the reason I wrote about chicken nuggets, Tyson was developing products. Initially they just, produce chicken, but then they started developing products, and they developed nuggets specifically for McDonald's.
Wow. So what are the conditions? Suppose I'm a worker, and I'm working with a really sharp knife, and I accidentally cut my finger to the bone. I get sent out to an external doctor to be seen by a medical doctor?
So Tyson Foods has on-site medical clinics, and they're third-party for providers, which gives the company a layer. They say, you know, we don't hire these nurses. Basically, if you cut yourself, you'll be sent to the on-site nurse. And then the structure of it is that the on-site nurse has 30 days in which they can tell the worker that they need to rest, ice, or take Tylenol.
Right, just an anti-inflammatory, anti-pain thing.
And because resting and icing, and that is not considered a recordable injury by the Occupational Health and Safety Organization. And so if you drive by a Tyson plant even today, out front they have a big sign saying, you know, 1,000 days of no recordable injuries. And so what workers said essentially is that they would have serious injuries, but the nurses would say, you're okay, go back to work. And that would lead them to having a more serious injury, or that they wanted to see a doctor, but nurses have to approve workers visiting a doctor. So one of the women, the workers in my book, she needed carpal tunnel surgery in both hands. And even by the end of the book, which, you know, this book takes place over 4 years, the surgery had not been approved.
After how many years?
I interviewed her for 4 years, but it was maybe a year and a half that she was seeking permission to get the surgery.
Permission? She has to have permission to get the surgery. So on one hand, you've got cuts. On the other hand, you've got liquids all over the place. How about this? What happens if liquid ends up in your eye?
Well, the liquids there are a lot of chemicals at plants, at meatpacking facilities, and Tyson, according to the EPA, has had the most chemical accidents of any U.S. meatpacking company. And in the case, yes.
Can you say that again?
Tyson has had the most chemical accidents of the U.S. meatpacking companies.
Wow. And it's the biggest.
And it's the biggest, yeah.
Right.
And so in my book, which at one of the plants in Arkansas where I was following workers, there was a chemical accident in 2011, which several workers had experienced. They had damaged their lungs. And so when I went back to research it, the local news said, you know, chemical leak, workers fine, workers, you know, return to work. And then when I started investigating it, the chemical leak had actually been because someone had incorrectly mixed two chemicals, ammonia and Clorox. It had produced a weapons-grade chemical that had really caused a lot of damage to the lungs of many workers. Mainly the long-term effects were the lungs, which came into play when COVID arrived.
Tell me more.
It turned out that several of the workers who died of COVID, meatpacking workers, had already experienced severe lung damage from chemical accidents. So when COVID arrived, they predicted their own death.
What?
One of the workers said, he told his wife, I have to keep working. He had only, one lung had been entirely damaged in a chemical accident. And he said, but I know that I am going, like if I get COVID, I will die. And he did.
And what about, did anybody ever get, I'm going on about these chemicals, did anybody ever get chemicals land in their eyes?
One of the stories, well, not chemicals, but one story from a worker was that he got blood in his eye.
That's a chemical, sure.
Yeah, and it became very infected.
It got infected?
It was swollen, and he actually was losing his vision, so then he went to the on-site nurse, and she said, no, you'll be fine, just take some Tylenol and go back to work. And he was thinking, I could lose my vision. And so part of the issue is that the on-site medical care is paid for, but if they want to go to an outside, get a second opinion from a doctor, they have to pay for that. And so many of them don't have very much money. But he decided, I'm going to go to a doctor because if I lose my eyesight, that affects the rest of my life.
And what happened?
He got treated by a doctor outside of the system.
And
non-sepsis.
did he recover?
He recovered, yeah.
But if he hadn't been treated, he may not have recovered.
That's what he felt, yeah.
Wow. Do these workers, who a large percentage of them seem to be non-native born, non-English speaking workers, do they have regular insurance, medical insurance, and what they call their superannuation, which in America you call the 401k? Do they have those sorts of things?
I mean, they do have, I'll just say I don't have all of the details. One of the reasons people start working in meatpacking is it pays more than minimum wage. Workers do get some kind of retirement, vacation, maybe, I don't know, they start out with a week a year or whatever it is. So there are benefits, and that is attractive to workers. But once they start the work, it's very dangerous. It's said to be the most dangerous job in the United States.
And your title of the book is Life and Death. Are you able to get hard statistics? Because with the ag-gag laws, and also with the fact that what's the American organisation called, the OSHA, who look after health and safety, say they can't monitor it. What sort of statistics are you getting with regard to their injuries and their early death rates?
Well, there have been a lot of studies, for example, about carpal tunnel, and there was a really great study done about chemical accidents across the meatpacking industry, which I saw published by CNN maybe last year. So there are people who are, especially academics, who are researching things like this. So a lot of, or even the number of amputations per day, which is, so there is data on information like that, and it's quite shocking in terms of the percentage. It's much higher than in other industries.
Now, you mentioned a worker mixed two chemicals together and something bad happened. I immediately thought perhaps their English language wasn't so good. So what sort of countries do the workers come from?
So at any given plant, at one plant, there could be people who speak 50 different languages. And in Arkansas, we have the largest population from the Marshall Islands outside of the Marshall Islands.
There are a bunch of islands in the South Pacific. What are they doing in the middle of the USA in the poorest state?
They're climate refugees, and the interesting thing is that so Tyson has a lot of relationships with refugee organizations. They offer jobs to refugees. And so the early Marshallese who came to the U.S. as climate refugees started working at Tyson, and the whole community largely works at Tyson.
Wow. So you briefly mentioned at the beginning something about underage workers. Can you tell me more about that?
Last year, the New York Times published an investigation of child labor across the United States because it's been on the rise.
Child labour is on the rise in one of the wealthiest countries on earth?
Yes.
Okay.
And one of the industries where they found children working was in the meatpacking industry. And you might wonder, how can this occur?
How? It seems impossible. Because surely they have to have identity and show the identity.
And Tyson, Tyson is a large chain, an enclosed chain from the chicken hatching, the chicken raising, the processing, even the medical facilities. And within that chain, a lot of things are third-party providers.
So they don't have responsibility for what the third party does.
So they can say, we did not hire any miners, because the miners are on the cleaning shift, which is the night shift, which involves a lot of chemicals, a lot of dangerous machinery, and it's a third-party provider that brings in the workers. As well as, for example, in the chicken houses, jobs like chicken catching, which people may not be familiar with, but if you have a chicken house full of 90,000 chickens, all those chickens have to go in these kind of little metal boxes that are loaded onto semi-trailers. And usually maybe 14, 15-year-olds, in the case of the workers that I'm familiar with, are throwing these 90,000 chickens into these metal boxes for maybe 10 hours or 16 hours, however long it takes to get all those chickens loaded onto a semi.
But chickens are not entirely benign and friendly. They have cockfighting, and these chicken birds are used to fight each other, and they can be quite vicious, especially to a younger person.
They are vicious, and so I sort of happened upon this topic because I was interviewing an organization that supports poultry workers who have issues with, wages that haven't been paid or things like that. And a labor organizer said, look at these videos of, in this case, it was two 14-year-olds from Guatemala who were working as, or 14 and a 15-year-old working as chicken catchers. And the chickens are vicious and they scratch. And of course, these kids had no protective wear. And so I think people don't realize what kinds of jobs these are and what role minors are playing.
One thing I haven't asked is, how did finding this all out, how did it affect you?
Well, I mean, navigating the work was really complex in terms of what the workers were going through and dealing with the death of loved ones and funerals and medical expenses. And then, the other part of it was also me thinking about, I stopped eating meat when I was reporting this. I just couldn't, be receiving all these photos and videos and all of this information about the meatpacking industry and continue to eat meat. Even though before that, my parents were part of the Back to Land movement and really were interested in growing their own food and buying meat from local farmers. But just doing this book made me just stop eating meat.
Wow, you really opened my eyes. I had no idea that something as innocent as a chicken could involve a potentially nasty supply chain that would exploit people. How can people, as we come to an end here, how can people follow you and your fine work, and besides buying your fine book there, Life and Death of the American Worker, how else can they follow you?
I have a website at alicedriver.com, and my only social media is Instagram, which is also my name, Alice Driver.
Thank you very much for coming online. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Carl. I appreciate it.
Shirtloads of Science is washed, spun and aired by the University of Sydney.